guys, this is Shelby with the Rogers Public Library. So this week for full steam ahead, I wanted to talk to you guys about genetics and genetic variants and how this happens, right? So there's a couple things that you need to keep in mind. I'll just turn that off real quick. The first is that all of our genetic traits are determined by our DNA, right? And specifically segments of DNA called genes, right? So it's a code basically of different base pairs that tell that get turned into a gene that get turned into a protein, right? And there's different versions of genes, right? Called alleles, and the alleles that we have determine what our traits are, whether we have brown hair or black hair or blonde hair. And we get when we have two copies of each gene, right? Two chromosomes, or two copies of all of our DNA, and we get one from each of our parents, right? So, a lot of traits are kind of complex, right? And they involve more than one gene. But there's a couple that are called Mendelian traits that are just determined by a single gene. One of these is earwax. Whether we have, there's two different alleles. One is for wet earwax and one is for dry earwax. And another one is whether we're able to break down the lactose in milk using an enzyme called lactase. And so, right, so you might have a parent like this that say they have they have the alleles that say they can break down milk or specifically lactose. And you might have another parent that has alleles that say they can't break it down, right? And these are their genetic traits that they're going to pass on to you. And so they have two copies of the alleles, but they can't pass four copies down to you, right? They have to pass one each to you, right? So you get one allele from each of your parents. And the way that would look is like this, right? So you have the lactose tolerant allele and the lactose intolerant allele, right? And when this happens, when you have two alleles that are different, it's called heterozygous, right? And then when it's the same, if you have like these two alleles or you have these two alleles, it'd be called homozygous, right? And when something like this happens, when you have two different alleles, one of them is dominant and one of them is recessive, right? And the dominant allele in this case is lactose tolerance. So in this case, you would be able to digest lactose, and it'd be the same as if you had these alleles, right? So we say that these alleles have the same phenotype, right? It's the same trait, the same way that two people with brown hair have the same phenotype, even if they don't have the same alleles, if there's some genetic variance going on there. But what's interesting about this example in particular is that, right, most people on the planet Earth are lactose intolerant, right? They can't digest lactose after they grow up. They can only digest it like when they're a baby and a little bit afterwards, like in childhood, around the age that you guys are. The people who are able to break down lactose are from different parts of the world. But what they have in common is that a long time ago, there was a lot of people in these areas who raised animals that make milk, right? Like goats and cows. So you think about it, if you live somewhere where there's a lot of dairy cows, and you're able to tolerate lactose, you're going to have a better chance of survival than, say, someone who can't eat dairy, who that gets sick when they drink too much milk. And so if you're better at drinking milk, and there's a lot of milk, then you're going to be better at passing your genes down onto new people, right? And so over time, like these simple variations and genotype increase, right? There's more people who are lactose tolerant, and you get large population changes, right? And so this is an evolutionary force, you say, right? So another example of this is sickle cell, right? So there's parts of Africa where there's a lot of malaria, and there's a specific mutation that makes you more resistant to the parasites that cause malaria. And so a lot of people have that trait. And because they have that trait, a lot of people also get from whose ancestors lived in West Africa develop sickle cell anemia. Um, right? But anyway, back to milk. Our craft for this week is pretty cool. We're going to be using milk to make a type of plastic, right? So I'm using powdered milk for this because we happen to have it and we need to use it. But of course, you can use any milk, liquid or powdered. You could probably use condensed milk even. So the key ingredient for this experiment, or the craft, I guess, isn't lactose. Instead, it's a protein in the milk called casein. Right, so we have milk and we have hot water. It needs to be about 120 degrees Fahrenheit. If the milk isn't hot enough, then the right thing won't happen. This is kind of finicky. So I'm going to add that. I just wanted to warm this up a little bit more. Just in case it had cooled off a little bit since I took its temperature using a candy thermometer. But it does need to be at least 120 degrees, but not much warmer than that because you're going to be putting your hands in it, right? And you don't want to get burned or anything. So have a grown-up help you heat up the milk. And if you can, use a thermometer to check its temperature. And you'll know if it's not warm enough because the chemical reaction won't happen correctly, right? But anyway, there's a protein in milk called casein. And this protein is not water soluble. It's suspended in the milk. And by increasing the acidity of the milk, we can cause it to coagulate, right? So it comes out of the solution and forms into a big globule. Big, gross globule. Right? And so instead of a nice homogenized mixture, we get a kind of a gross looking mixture of two different things. Oh, this is really cool. Right? So we have a kind of a yellowish liquid, and we have a white blob. And so these are called Curds and Whey, right? And you guys might have heard the nursery rhyme, Little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet eating her curds and whey. Along came a spider and sat down beside her and carried Miss Muffet away. Right. So we have the curds, which are primarily casein, and we have a towel right here. We're going to try to dry this off. This is a little bit messy. I've gotten a lot of vinegar all over the place, but it doesn't. It's pretty easy to clean up, right? People use vinegar to clean things actually, so you just need to wipe it down really. We have this, and now you can mold it. You can make different shapes. It's not really super easy to mold the way that, say, Play-Doh is or clay, but you can. I used a silicone mold to make a lot of strawberries using this. Not this specific lump, but some ones that I made earlier. Right, so silicone mold, lots of strawberries, and then I painted them with acrylic and temperate paints. And they turned out pretty well. They're a little odd, a little lumpy shaped. As for the drying process, right, so you just want to pat it down as well as you can, get as much moisture out. But it'll dry and harden over the course of a couple of days. And it is edible, right? If we did a couple things differently, and did a little bit more processing, we could turn this into a cheese like mozzarella or something. But this is actually used, or a very similar process is used historically to make plastics before synthetic plastic was invented. The main difference being that once you got the curds like this, you treat it with formaldehyde, which we aren't using because it's toxic, so it's not fun to mess with. Yeah. So that's kind of a crash and experiment in itself. But I do have another experiment for you guys as well. This is one that you can do with relatives, especially if you live with your parents or siblings or grandparents. Um, Although you don't, you get these strips, right? So these are sodium benzoate paper strips. There's a couple other kinds of taste strips that you can get as well. But the ability to taste them is determined by your genetics, right? So if you are the tasting ability is dominant, so it doesn't taste like anything to me. It's maybe a little bit sweet, um, but it doesn't really have a pronounced taste. So I think that I probably have the recessive trait or two recessive alleles, and I'm not able to taste it. But people who are able to taste it, they'll say that it's sweet or salty or bitter, just depending on a bunch of other factors. And sodium benzoate, it is a food additive, right? So it's added to things like soda sometimes as a preservative, but it's also naturally occurring in a lot of different fruits and vegetables in the form of benzoic acid. Right, benzoic acid and sodium benzoate, they're pretty much the same thing as far as preservatives are concerned. Um, so we have our cheese, and we have our taste strips, and we have our alleles. And that's it for this week, you guys. I hope you had fun, and I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.